Hello.
So, hi everybody. So for everybody just joining us, um, I'm so excited to have David Danzmayr here. And obviously Meredith, our principal violist, is very excited to see you too. I think we'll have a lot of musicians from the orchestra joining us. And I'll go over this when we get started with our full group. But as a reminder, if you have questions or comments about anything we're talking about or otherwise, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will see them and do our best to get to them. Okay, so I think we're just about ready.
Good.
Okay, here we go. Let's see if I can share this video successfully.
That would be great.
Yay!
Ah, beautiful. Very, very. Like I said, when I watched the clip, I mean, like the orchestra sounds so good, and it's a hard piece. It's such a beautiful piece, but the orchestra just had such a great sound, such a beautiful playing. It's wonderful.
Well, I know everybody just loved getting to work with you again, and I think that piece was new to a lot, if not most of us, and it was really great to get to sort of learn it all together, and that was a really special week. So everybody, I'm so excited to have the amazing David Danzmayr here as my guest this week. Those of you who are Symphony subscribers will probably recognize him. He's been with the symphony twice, back in, I think, 2017 and again in 2018.
Yeah, sounds right.
And so yeah, we're going to be exploring all things Danzmayr today. Just a brief explanation for those of you who weren't here before the video. If you have questions or comments about anything, there's a Q&A button you can use. You can also use the chat function, and we will do our best to get to those, both through the hour and at the end. I want to thank our restaurant partners. We've got the Silver Trumpet Restaurant and Bar in Costa Mesa, Hendrix Restaurant and Bar in Laguna Niguel, Toast Kitchen and Bakery in Costa Mesa, Provenance in Newport Beach, Haven Craft Kitchen and Bar in Orange, Descanso Restaurant in Costa Mesa, and Adya in Irvine. And they're all offering different specials related to these mixers. So definitely check them out and take advantage of it. So just as a brief background, I want to tell everybody about your amazing biography. David is the chief conductor of the Zagreb Philharmonic, also music director of the Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra in Columbus. He's the former music director of the Illinois Philharmonic, a laureate of all sorts of fancy conducting competitions like the Gustav Mahler competition, the Malko competition. And he's also guest conducted all over the world, obviously with Pacific Symphony, Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, Grant Park Festival Orchestra, Minnesota Orchestra, Odense Symphony Orchestra, Basel, Iceland Symphony, the list goes on and on. And he's just amazing. And everyone I know glows about him whenever they talk about him. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited.
Thanks for having me. That was like the nicest introduction I've ever got, I think.
So I want to just basically start at the very beginning, just telling us, so you're from Salzburg, right? In Austria.
Yes, I mean, if you want to start at the very, very beginning, I was actually born in Oberndorf, which is a village slightly outside of Salzburg. And the interesting thing about that village is that Silent Night, the song Silent Night has been written there. It's just like,
wow,
20 kilometers north of Salzburg. And I was born there because it had a new birth hospital. So my mom decided, it's worth the drive in the middle of winter. I'm a January kid. So my parents have some interesting stories about that day.
I bet.
But then grew up in Salzburg, yeah.
So did you come from a musical family or have a lot of music around when you were growing up?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because I think my upbringing was, it was very mixed. I think a lot about it at the moment. My father is a musician, was working at the radio. My mother, a painter, but with drawings, like an illustrator, basically, freelance at that time. And I grew up with in a fairly low money household, but there was one incredible boon to my dad's job, and that was that he had access to the Salzburg Festival concerts because he was the producer. You see actually when you look for the name Danzmayr, you see actually a lot of CDs out there that were recorded at the Salzburg Festival where my father is the producer. And yeah, and the great thing for me was, right, that, I was in events that, my parents would have never been able to afford in a normal way, right? So I was sitting in all this festival concerts. I saw Abado when I was a kid, Boulez, then Szandor Wijk at the Camerata in Salzburg at that time. And I was allowed to go into rehearsals. I don't know if I was allowed, but my dad just took me with him and, was just like, wow. Be quiet, one word and you're out. And that was basically the thing, yeah.
That sounds amazing. And, I'm just curious also because I feel like Salzburg has so many connotations in terms of the musical history there and obviously Mozart's relationship with the city. And like you mentioned, the Salzburg Festival. What was it like growing up in a town like that? Is music just like everywhere you look?
Yeah, too much everywhere in some way. Actually, the great thing about the time when I grew up in Salzburg is that there was an atmosphere of an opening up. Mortier had taken over the Salzburg Festival, and he vouched that the festival would be less conservative, more open to a kind of like new music and to a new taste. I think before Mortier, they really played barely modern music, and it was very, very, very traditional. And I think in his time also, like, director-wise, Peter Sellers did a lot of crazy projects there, and Markus Hinterhäuser, who is now the chief of the festival, was leading a contemporary music festival where I saw like you know, things like a John Cage evening and these kind of things. And at the same time, in the young scene, you know, with the young people, there was a really good, like, you know, electronic music scene, you know, forming. And so I think the time that I grew up in Salzburg was very interesting, because this traditional, very, very traditional town, and this new spin of kind of like, we don't only want tradition, we want also new stuff, was really clashing against each other. There was a lot of like heated discussions about that as well. And so I enjoyed my time growing up there. I think it was a good time, you know.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, your first instrument was the piano, right?
That's correct. Yeah. I started learning piano first. Yeah.
And so at what point in your education did you, like, was there a definitive point where you decided to go towards conducting and sort of make that shift away from performance?
Yeah, always. So the thing is, I never wanted to become a pianist. I just learned playing the piano when I was 6, because I just loved the instrument and I loved music. And it's, I think piano was a very logical instrument for me. First, we had a, you know, very broken, very bad piano at home, very, you know, kind of like was hard to tune already. But at the same time, it was a piano that was there. And I don't think, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I would have had the patience for violin to learn, or cello, you know, a string instrument. And, you know, seeing my daughter, she learns the flute, you know, I know that, you know,
I'm sorry.
Close to your heart. No, it's actually, it's kind of like, you know, a nice sounding instrument, but this kind of like, you know, the phase until you get a note out of the instrument. And so for me, piano was great, because you sit down and you hit your hands on the instrument and some sound comes out. The intonation is also taken care of, which is great, you know. Piano helped. But I always wanted to become a conductor, with the only kind of like, you know, there was one phase where I was young where I, of course, wanted to become a soccer player, like every European kid, you know, at some point in their life. But I never, like, there was never any, my mother thought, my mom was kind of keen. She was like, oh, you're so talented on the piano, practice hard. And, you know, I had a very good teacher, but she was delusional, you know. She knew, I mean, like my dad knew, I knew, everybody knew who, you know, who talked to me that I don't want to become a pianist. My mom was the only person who held out this hope somehow.
That's amazing. So when you started at the conservatory, the Mozarteum, was it as a pianist or as a conductor or both? I started first when I was 10 as a pianist. They had this, I like the name. They called me an extraordinary student. There was though nothing extraordinary about me. I was just young, and so I couldn't be an ordinary student. So, you know, I went there, got some tuition there. I wasn't particularly happy. I was always the oddball, always the crazy one, but, you know, did things like, I remember I had a very important exam when I was 13 that every 2 years we had to take some, you know, play some concert for an exam. And about 1 month or a couple of weeks before the exam, I played goalie in soccer and I broke my finger, you know, just splintered my thumb. And had to tell my teacher, and he didn't even yell at me. He was so shocked that he was just silent on the line, because nobody did this kind of stupid things apart from me. I was really very, very odd for them. So I quit then when I was 15. I went back to my old piano teacher just for private lessons. Actually, didn't really pursue the piano anymore for 3 years until I was 18. I did actually play Carnival of the Animals on the piano with my school orchestra and played a lot of chamber music, but didn't keep up with the piano in the kind of like 3 hours a day practice thing or so. And then when I was 18, I went back to Mozarteum. Dennis Russell Davis, American conductor, was there, and then I started studying conducting. Oh, wow. Okay. And I have to ask, because I've heard it from some friends of mine who went there. Is it true that the dorms for the Mozarteum are in the old Sound of Music house, or like that sort of compound?
Yeah, there are different dorms, but there is actually, the interesting thing is I didn't stay in the dorm. I stayed in the shared flat with friends later. But very close actually to where where the house of my mom is one of these dorms from Mozarteum. And it's hilarious because when you look from the outside, you think like, oh, these fancy kind of like, you know, snooty people in Salzburg. It's amazing. It is called like something like Castle Frohnburg, you know. But it's incredible because you have an alley, you drive along in an alley, and then you have this incredibly beautiful building from the outside. I mean, I have seen, you know, on parties, I've seen the rooms inside. They are not as fancy from the inside as many people share, right? But it's incredible when you show the photo from the outset to some other student from another country, like, you know, that's where we house. People think like, you know, you're crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So then I'm curious. So after that, you went to the Sibelius Academy?
I did when I was 24. Yeah.
And what inspired you to go to Finland?
I think the Sibelius Academy is basically, at least throughout Europe, you know, known as the best place that you can study conducting. It's like this, it has this kind of like aura of the, if you make it in there, you will have a career. And it's not quite true, not everybody, but it's, you know, you get a good likelihood, you get a very good training. And the reason is that so many of these Finnish conductors like Salonen and as Jukka-Pekka Saraste, and, you know, all of these people went through the Sibelius Academy. You know, there's a lot of, you know, Susanna Marki, you know, was, you know, 10 years before me there maybe. And so there is a lot of people who come out there. And I think the reason for that is, I mean, first of all, they have great teachers and they have a good system that every week they, you know, there's a main teacher, but every second week there is a guest teacher kind of, which really helps, you know, to shake things up. But they have twice a week orchestra. For I think 3-hour rehearsals, and this is student orchestra, but they get paid, so they need to be really prepared. And you know, every week you do a different repertoire. It's hard. But when I saw the repertoire list the first time, I nearly started to cry. I didn't believe it. I thought it was like a prank. So I said to the administrator, I was like, "What is this?" He's like, "That's the repertoire list." I said to him, "I can't do that. I thought it's a job." He was like, "Yeah, you have to. That's your list." You know, it was every week a new repertoire, every single week, and for, you know, later as a conductor, that becomes more normal, but at the same time, you have a repertoire. As a student, you don't have a repertoire. Every piece is, you know, pretty much every piece is first learn. It's insane, but you know, you learn to adapt.
Well, I mean, honestly, it sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds like a priceless experience in terms of getting to play that or like conduct that many pieces with a live orchestra and not have your first time be,
invaluable. It's and also the system is fantastic because they set up a camera and they film you. And so the teacher, I mean, you know, Leif Segerström would sometimes scream like just insults at us over the orchestra, or when there was a wrong note that we didn't immediately pick out, he would yell or so, very shortly. But there was none of this, what I hear sometimes from conducting trainings, this endless talk and explanation that then gets deducted from the time in reality, right? It was really, we separated the time completely equally. So we would kind of like have the total time divided by the number of conductors who were present. And that was the minutes you got, and that was your time. And that was really time to conduct. That was really time to do the job. And then afterwards, you know, the teacher would watch the video with you and then kind of like beat you up on that. So the time that you got in front of the orchestra was really your time. And that's, I mean, that's essential.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I read that you worked with Leif Segerström while you were there.
Yeah, I did. That was my main teacher. Yeah.
So, I mean, I've never met him, but I feel like that would be very interesting.
Yeah, to understand how the lessons were, that there is a video of him conducting Scheherazade with the Symphonia Galizia, you know, that where he starts to scream and the orchestra screams back like pirates, because he had the idea that, you know, that the Sindbad people on the ship, it needs to be symbolized. That is him. If, you know, some people maybe watch the video and think he did to have one crazy day. No, I mean, and with all admiration, I mean, you know, I had you know, he could be very brutal. He can be very brutal. What you like direct, but it's more than direct. He could really tear you apart. But it was never without reason, right? He never, you know, when you conducted really good, and so he never would kind of like be hard to you. It was just like, you know, on the off weeks. But yeah, when you watch this video of him screaming in the middle of the concert around, that's him, you know, that every lesson.
That's like amazing.
Every lesson there was some totally crazy moment. So it was fantastic.
So sort of like that Scheherazade video, did he have a lot of sort of non-standard interpretations, or how did that work in terms of teaching you the repertoire?
I think, interestingly, I think in that way, he was, you know, I mean, we had these two types of lessons. One was with the camera where you would just watch the video and he would basically comment, or he would not comment. Sometimes he would sit there for silent for 5 minutes and then just like throw one insult at you, and that's it, you know, and yeah, everybody knew it was pretty bad. But on other times he would really kind of like go analyze it, like you're conducting with you, what you could do better. But, you know, he was very much on the natural way of being. So I always got beaten up by him if I tried to copy people, or if he had the instinct that I was doing something that's not coming natural out of my body or out of myself. And in that way, he was absolutely amazing. So he never tried to bend somebody into a direction that they are not. That was quite interesting. And then sometimes there were the analysis lessons where he would take a score and just like, you know, would talk through and sing through. So basically we would sit around the table, everybody would sing, everybody on a different page most probably. So I mean, it was like a total cacophony, but the way he approached scores was mesmerizing. I mean, I remember one time we went through Sibelius' Fourth Symphony with him, and you know, I felt like a little warm afterwards, because like what he saw in the score, also in terms of pictures, like first of all in an analytical way, but also in terms of what means the first trombone entrance. You know, why is the trombones there? Everything had a meaning for him, right? So that was the high points. The funny low point was when a friend of mine asked him about rehearsal technique, you know, because like, you know, he never commented really on how to rehearse. And so a friend of mine asked him, what do you think to rehearse? And he just said just look for the universal inspiration of the nice sound in your head. Don't listen to anything else. Just you need to feel the inspiration of the universe or something. And that was it. We were like, great. But, yeah. He had actually an incredible analytical mind. I also saw him one time negotiating a contract, or kind of like a possible contract. And he immediately changed from crazy to businessman and was down with the numbers and everything. So, I mean, he's very, very bright guy, speaks 7 or something languages fluently. And so very, very bright.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And a prolific composer too, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Now over 300 symphonies, I think, you know. It's
wow.
He kind of like writes them one after the other, I guess.
That's amazing. So apart from him, I'm wondering, are there any other like inspirational conductors who you really look to, you know, just admire them, or that you try to incorporate specific things about their style into your own?
Yeah, there were like a couple of very influential conductors. I mean, like obviously my first teacher, Dennis Russell Davis, was influential. Also because he sent me away at a point. It was like, you know, I was getting a little bit comfortable, settled in Salzburg with him as a teacher, and he had actually the strength of character that shows also kind of like a really good teacher to you know, talk with me and be like, you know, David, you gotta go away, go out in the world and find, you know, somebody else that gives you. Dennis Russell Davis and I got fantastically along. You know, it was wonderful to me, but we are very different, very, very different characters, very different conductors. And he thought, I need somebody who is a little bit closer. Then I had a master class with a conductor called Hans Zender, who was the principal conductor of the Freiburg Radio Orchestra and had a fantastic career, fantastic composer, did a Winterreise from Schubert instrumentation that is absolutely fascinating. And he was so influential. I only met him for 2 weeks, but he showed me like what a character can do. It was incredible. I was in a not very good place when I arrived at the conducting class, not very happy. And just by spending 2 weeks with him, basically, I had the feeling I became a more life-enjoying, better person. It was just like, you know, when you meet this kind of like what we call maybe holy man or something, you know, when you meet somebody who is such a incredible character, such an incredible, loving, caring man. I mean, it was just incredible. Then, of course, Leif Segerstam, some of the guest teachers in Helsinki. Then before and after that, Pierre Boulez and Claudio Abbado. I mean, I was with them with the Gustav Mahler Youth Orchestra and could like spend the rehearsal time with them and so on. That was just, I mean, particularly Abbado was just mind-blowing. You know, I mean, I will never forget when he walked in front of the orchestra. The assistant conductor prepared the orchestra. Very good conductor. And then Abbado came and took over first rehearsal after a week or so. And it's just, you know, you can't describe it with words. He gave an upbeat, started conducting, and the whole orchestra formed into this Abbado sound, into this lush, big, I mean, I was sitting, I was like, what is he doing? What is he doing? But
wow.
You can't copy that, right? You have to find your own way. There is only the own path that you plow, kind of like step by step, I guess. But that was mesmerizing, seeing Abbado do that. That was
yeah, that sounds amazing. And then, so after you finish your studies, one thing I've always been really curious about is how does a conductor make the transition from student to professional? Because that seems like, so I'm just curious, like how large a role does like artist management play in, you know, getting those initial weeks with professional orchestras or competitions, for example? Like how does that transition, is there a typical way it happens?
No, yeah, well, I think there might be a typical way. My way is certainly kind of like, you know, it's very much like me, kind of like, I have the feeling I always need to do things a kind of like stupid way, you know, and that was the same with kind of like starting the conducting thing, because I came back from Helsinki and then I finished my studies in Salzburg, like right at the end of that year, just like 2 months later, got my diploma, and I was like, great. And then I started to think, well, what am I doing now, right? I mean, like, ideally, I would say if you're a student, you should, in your last 2 years or so, you should, I don't know, get a plan, get a master plan. It's hard, of course, like, it doesn't get easier for conductors, I guess. You come out, I would say in Germany, the normal way would be to become a repetitor at an opera house and play piano. But the problem is, starting already when I was young, that some of these repetitor positions were without conducting, you know, they split that. Which is very bad, because then pianists get the job. I mean, you know, a really trained pianist will play better than you most probably as a conductor. So it's hard. But for me, it was just like 2 years of saying yes to every thing that came my way. I did a lot of contemporary music in that time. And partly was like because nobody else wanted to do it. Like I never understood that. Some people came out of college and were super picky. They're like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I'm like, look, if I can conduct like some horrific contemporary music and get like, what did I get? Between 200 and 500 euros. So for you know, for that, that's great in every way. And so I became like something of a kind of like resident conductor of the Austrian Contemporary Music Ensemble. Never as a title, but every time they needed somebody and they didn't really have a lot of money to pay, or, you know, often when they came, they wanted maybe to play a piece without conductor, some octet. They thought like they can do it without conductor. And then in the rehearsal period, they found out it takes too many rehearsals, complicated piece takes too many rehearsals without conductor. So they would call me, they're like, hey, David, what are you doing in 2 days' time? I was like, nothing. Always honest, they were like, okay, come to the office, get the score, come tomorrow to the rehearsal and conduct the piece, right? And that was good, because I actually learned, you know, to do crazy pieces. I mean, like some of the kind of, and led to great chances, you know, when they needed somebody to study a piece for Boulez, his own piece, which made me very nervous. They called me because they knew me, you know, I had already done 10 things with them, and they called me and were like, David, you want to do something for Boulez? I'm like, are you kidding me? Of course, right? I also never asked for money first. You know, I always trusted them that they would give me whatever they can, which was not a lot, but, you know, it was, you know, kept me somehow kind of like, you know, the fridge full would be wrong, but, you know, there was some kind of pasta in the fridge or so. And then after 2 years, you know, I was kind of like applying for different things. And then after 2 years, the job in the Scottish National Orchestra came up. And I had heard about the job because a friend of mine that I met at a competition told me about it. He was kind of, he became my predecessor basically. And he was gushing about the job. He was like, oh, it's so great. He was doing it. He was like, oh, I conduct all the time. It's fantastic. And so when this job came up, I was like, that's it. And I was strangely convinced, because I'm actually normally the opposite. I'm like, you know, am I good enough for this? Can I do this? But strangely, when I saw the job, I told everybody, it was totally weird. I told everybody I will get the job. I was weirdly convinced that I would fly up there and just get it. When they invited me, I mean, first you have to send the video, and then I was one of 9 people or 10 people that got invited. And I kind of knew it, you know, I felt it. I felt that's the one, that's the job. And, you know, from then on, it went upwards. It was still a struggle, right? I was 3 years in Scotland. Assistant conductors in UK get, you know, obviously, you know, paid very, very little. So it was a financial struggle, but it was also, the job was amazing. The orchestra was amazing. The management was amazing. Everybody was great to me, basically. But the problem was, again, I was quite slow, because that's the time when you call like agents all the time and you send letters and you could have like tried to make a career, but I don't have that concept in my character, you know, this kind of like building your career and connecting and, you know, social connections and all of that. I was sitting at home learning scores. And then after 3 years, I was there without an agent. Yeah.
Well, I mean, honestly, it seems like even if that's the slower way, it's probably ultimately the most, the best way in terms of the music.
I think, I mean, for me, definitely, because I take a while to learn scores. I'm not I'm not one of these whiz kids who kind of like look at the score for 2 days and kind of like memorize it. Photographic memory, all of that is not me. So, for me, I think the way that, in hindsight, of course, there were kind of like times where I kind of like was getting anxious, or where I was worried, or like it didn't go fast enough for me. But when I look back now over the last 15 years, I think things came, at times that made sense for me, right? You don't want to get a hugely powerful management when you're 23, when you're not ready for it. I mean, some conductors are astonishingly ready when they're really young, right? But I think for me, it would have been a disaster. Like if I would have been put in front of an orchestra like the Pacific Symphony with 23, 24, I think I would have blown it. I think I wouldn't have been ready to really kind of like, do it. Maybe on the conducting side more so, but in terms of, how to speak to people in rehearsals, it's so hard to figure out. It's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, also you mentioned, the process of learning scores and getting prepared for this sort of thing. And, one of the questions that I had prepared to ask you that I was curious about was how a conductor practices.
Huh.
And then I look it up and you have a how-to video on YouTube. So why don't we take a look at that?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back and you can fill us in. Let's see if I can do this.
I often get asked the question, how does a conductor actually learn a score? There are actually 3 different methods how you can approach learning a score. Method 1, listening to recordings. This is for the lazy bastards. Method 2, imagining the music in your head. Or the ones who just pretend they can imagine even the most complicated score by just looking at it. Pretend? Nonsense! I'm just better than you and I have nicer hair. I guess 1% of conductors really can. Hats off to them. Method 3, playing the music. If the conductor has good piano skills and the score is fairly easy, then it will sound something like this. If the conductor, however, has poor piano skills,
Nee, du hast doch wieder nicht geübt.
Or the score is very complicated, it might sound more like this. Combined methods. But to be honest, the most likely way to learn a score is actually a combination of a lot of methods. Of course, every conductor has a different way of learning scores, but most of us use a mix of all kinds of different ways for all kinds of different conductors. But you haven't expected an easy answer, have you?
Okay, that was amazing.
Thank you.
We have a question from our principal
Sure.
violist about who drew the illustrations for that.
I actually did. I did, I did pretty much, everything in the video myself, apart from, the part that my daughter played. I wanted to do it initially as a family project, and we filmed it, and like one of the cameras had a kind of like smudge on it, so I had to refilm it, everything, and then I had to rewrite it. So if I would have known, of course, every project you start that you don't really know what you're doing takes a lot of time. So it was a really interesting experience for me. It was totally learning by doing, it's
well, it's very impressive.
Thank you.
So just sort of going off of some of the things you talked about in the video, I'm curious, like, I imagine that practicing as a conductor for an upcoming engagement would be very different if you're working on like a Beethoven symphony versus something like, well, like you and I did the Ligeti violin concerto together with a season ago, and I'm sure the practice would be very different depending on that. So how, like, or like, you mentioned that you did so much work in contemporary music in general, and I just imagine that would be a very different process.
Yeah, I mean, it is a different process. I mean, I try to approach scores in a way that the composer likely approached it. Like, when I learn Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms or so, I go often, to the piano and kind of like, start playing the score on the piano. Of course, in a simplified way, you don't play every voice all the time, but, by and large. And then, learn it from there and kind of like, of course, then, and often, the pieces then very well. I mean, like when I now revisit, Brahms' First Symphony or so, I don't go to the piano anymore. I just like look at the score, I listen, in my head. But often also with this kind of like standard repertoire, I think it can be interesting to compare different, if you compare very different recordings sometimes, Nowadays, there is good access to that. If you, for example, listen to, Gardiner doing Beethoven or so, it's a very interesting, to hear how it kind of like historically, an ensemble playing on old instruments kind of like would play it. And so there is that. With contemporary music, it depends very much on the composer, If it's, something like Golyov, I learned it in a somewhat similar way, because there is a lot of harmony there, lots of melody. I would say everything that's kind of based harmonic melodic, I definitely to a degree study on the piano and kind of like, by reading it. Maybe sometimes, the side singing exercise, kind of like singing through the parts.
Yeah.
If it's very atonal, it gets really tough, because when you have like 7 voice chords, it's really difficult sometimes. And I mean, even when you have, really trained, side singing and ears, some pieces like the Ligeti, I mean, it's hard to read. It's just very hard to read. So I would say, I mean, if when you play it, right, I mean, you kind of like sometimes are like, oh, and then you have this effect, and of course you have the quarter tones, with the Ligeti, you have all of these kind of like, high and lower tones, so you can't replicate it on the piano anyway, so then it's more an analytical thing and really trying to, and honestly, every time, like I have a method that every time when I learn a solo concerto, in that case, it doesn't matter if it's like, old or new, I listen to a lot of different records. It's the only time when I allowed it myself, because I think it's problematic when you have a symphony and you listen too much to recordings. It just like, informs your interpretation too much. It kind of like shades, and it's a shortcut that you shouldn't take, I think, it's every shortcut comes at a price. Whereas with a solo concerto, particularly something complicated with Ligeti, if you sit in front of the score and you can follow, and really kind of like get to the point where you kind of know what you're doing and you can follow like say 5 to 10 completely different soloists in different tempi, different transitions, and you still can, I mean, with the Ligeti, actually, one of the challenges was to be able to really, really follow the violin part. And then in the end, I realized, well, the violin has to follow me a lot because that's just how it works, right? But I did it the first time. I didn't do the piece before. So I was like, I should at least be able to really listen to the violin part and always kind of like know where my beat needs to be placed. And that's hard enough. The first time we listen to a Ligeti violin concerto recording, you look at the score, you're like, I can follow it with my eyes, but together with my hands, on these bars, it's very hard. It takes a while. So I think for following a solo concerto, that's an important preparation. That whatever the soloist does, you still have an idea of, I am firm enough with the piece that I can follow. Yeah. But the Ligeti was very analytical. Also, like these things when is it the second movement or the third movement where they play on this? Did you also have one of that? No, it was just oboe and clarinet. The ocarina?
Oh, it was just oboe and clarinet. The
it was
ocarina.
Just oboe and clarinet, right? You didn't. Yeah. But I mean, like, how do you read an ocarina? So you go online and you're like, how do you even read that line?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was definitely an experience to remember.
It is an experience. I think it's an interesting piece, but it was a lot of work. Also, I mean, for you anyway, as players, but also as a conductor, when you open the score the first time, you kind of like, you need to get an orientation, you know, with analyzers, you need to first find your way around, you know, the piece and get an idea what's going on.
Yeah. Well, you said that was your first time doing it?
Yeah.
That's amazing. I would not have guessed that.
Well, I mean, I think the good thing was, like, you know, the orchestra was very prepared. The good thing was, I think everybody wanted to make it work. You know, there was a certain level that I felt immediately that people were like, yeah, we want security. We don't want to just like somehow survive the piece. We actually want to feel, you know, that we can do it. And so I thought the work was in that way easy for me as a conductor, because if you work with motivated people, it makes the job just much easier.
Yeah. And for those of you out there who aren't familiar with the Ligeti Violin Concerto, definitely check it out. It is a wild ride.
Yeah.
So just coming back to your history with Pacific Symphony, you know, like I said, you came, I think, in like 2017-ish, and we did Mendelssohn's Third Symphony. It was basically a Scottish themed program.
It was a Scottish program. It was a Scottish program, yeah.
Yeah, which I assume was a nod to your time in Scotland.
I think I wanted, I can't remember exactly how it came together, but I remember, you know, I love conducting the Scottish for Mendelssohn. It's just like one of the pieces that I really kind of like to do. And so that hasn't been played, I think, by Pacific for a while. And so, it wasn't easy, you know, we could agree on that easily. And then, you know, I kind of talked a little bit about how I'm Scottish too. And you know, then I think the soloist wanted to do the Scottish fantasy. And so I was like, well, then let's start with this McCann Land of Mountain and Flood piece, because that's actually a Scottish composer to kind of like tie it together. So yeah, it's a lovely program actually.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And then when you came back, you know, obviously we did Prokofiev's Seventh Symphony, which we saw a clip of, which you know, was I think fairly new to a lot of the musicians in the orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And then some more standard pieces like Chopin Piano Concerto, Night on Bald Mountain. And I think, you know, one of the things that struck me both times when you came and when I talked to other musicians that they seemed to think also was, you know, just so much clarity in your technique and also in your expressive intent, but it also sort of allowed the musicians to sort of express themselves freely and fully. And I think everyone really appreciated that. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it's important as a musician that you don't feel like you're put in shackles. I mean, I also don't want that, right? And it's actually a give and take, you know. One of the things that I always enjoyed about working with Pacific, with you guys, was that there was always a sense of camaraderie, also inside of the orchestra. You know, there's a good atmosphere, but also towards the conductor, there is a sense of trust in the beginning, you know, and when you can start as a conductor and come and musicians seem to be open to ideas, I think it's much easier to have this give and take relationship, right? That you really want on stage, because neither the conductor nor the musicians want to feel like you're bound by some, you know, shackles that don't need to be there. We are musicians. We want to express ourselves, you know, that's why we got into music, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it definitely shows when working with you, and that's awesome. We had a couple questions related to this. Susan Potters, Meredith's mother, wants to know, how do you balance achieving your own interpretation of a given piece with allowing the individual players leeway to make their own artistic choices?
That depends. I mean, you know, if somebody, I mean, you know, in particular, as a, you know, from flute solos, when you think about, you know, Brahms' Fourth Symphony, you have a big flute solo, you need to be willing to compromise as a conductor, I think, you know. I mean, for me, you have a couple of very important choices as a conductor, I think, where you should not give in too much. One of them is tempo. I think, you know, some conductors are too willing to compromise on tempo or to let the tempo sink a little bit, for example, in a fast movement. And I think that's something that I'm personally a little bit allergic to, because I sometimes tempi that feel initially, particularly in the first rehearsals, quite uncomfortable for the orchestra, can be very valuable and very good tempi. And some tempi actually that feel hard in a rehearsal feel really easy in a concert once you have done it a couple of times in rehearsals, because if it goes at a certain pace, it's not, the focus is not on every single note so much anymore. So sometimes it can be really relieving. So I think there are some real choices that as a conductor you should really have decided with. And I'm not saying being completely firm and like set in stone, but I think you should really know what interpretation you want as a conductor. You should really come with a very clear idea, and that's part of the fun of preparing. But every orchestra is different. Every orchestra has different strengths and a different sound. Between different countries, often there is difference in sound. You have different amount of rehearsal time, and so I think that's where the instinct needs to take over. The honest answer is, in the end, it comes down to experience. You make so many mistakes as a conductor, and then you hope, when you say like the first time you conduct, you make 100 mistakes. The second time you conduct, you aim for 99 mistakes. I think like that's kind of like good aim to kind of like just get the horrendous mistakes that you make in front of orchestras just down to an acceptable level. And I think then, then musicians feel that it's a give and take.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We had another question from Rosalind Britton, who wants to know, when you're a guest conductor, you have a limited time to establish rapport with a new group of musicians. What are the most important things you do to establish this rapport given, the limited rehearsal time?
Say hello and start conduct. That's actually my thing. And everybody, but I think, every conductor is different. I think some conductors are quite successfully with, maybe giving, talking for 30 seconds, saying something nice, maybe about the place there. I don't know, I think every conductor has their different, way. I can't do that. Like I tried to, and it kind of like, I think comes across as maybe insincere. It's much easier when you come the second time, because then you can say something like, hey, you still remember the wonderful concert we had, and kind of like looking forward to work again, right? If you enjoyed your time together. So that makes it easier. But for me, the first time I noticed for myself, the best thing for me is to get making music as quickly as possible, Of course, I think you should be very polite. You need to say, a really kind of like well-meant good evening or good morning whenever the rehearsal is, and acknowledge that you are very happy to work here. But then for me, it's important to immediately start making music. And I think once you kind of like, the first time I came, I remember I played for the whole symphony, not just the first movement, but the whole Mendelssohn symphony. I think that gives each other time, half an hour about it. So gives you a good time to get an idea, what works and how things are going.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned also that, when you guest conduct somewhere, you get to know, an orchestra and maybe their sound and strengths, weaknesses, same with the hall, like quirks of a hall, advantages of a hall. So when you come back a second or third time to an orchestra to guest conduct, are those things that you take into consideration when you're programming to return, or do you try to program more in a vacuum and just bring a program that you feel strongly about?
I think I'm leaning more towards the vacuum. It depends. I mean, like on the level of an orchestra like the Pacific Symphony, I think I generally try to program something that fits in the season. Of course you talk with the artistic administrator always, you have a conversation which pieces are possible. Then, orchestras have music directors, so some pieces are off the list anyway, because, it's, the music director wants to do them. So, there is actually less choice than you would think in some ways, right? Because, many pieces have been played the seasons before, etc. I think the choice of program in the terms of orchestra comes more into the equation if you work on a lesser level and you have an orchestra where there are some specific weaknesses, right? I mean, if you have an orchestra where the principal horn is not particularly good, you might not program Tchaikovsky 5 as a guest conductor. If you have the feeling that the principal flute has difficulties, maybe Brahms 4 is not the first choice. I mean, it has never really influenced my choices very much, but I could imagine that if you deal with a situation where on a lower level of an orchestra there are some weaknesses that you don't want to expose them necessarily, right?
Yeah. So just still on the subject of programming, like I said, both times that you came to Pacific Symphony, you brought, I thought, really interesting and engaging programs. And it was sort of a nice mix of familiar works like, the Mendelssohn Symphony, or like the Mussorgsky Night on Bald Mountain, with pieces that were new, I think, to a lot of the musicians, like the Makun and the Prokofiev 7. And I would think to the audiences as well. And I'm just curious, like in general, what is your philosophy behind programming a concert or a subscription week like that? Is that intentional that you try to have a blend of something familiar and less so?
Yeah, I think that's pretty, when you look also at my programs as a music director with my orchestras and so, I think that's pretty consistent in my programming. I do that, I think, because I enjoyed that always when I was sitting in the audience very much, you know, when you get a piece that you look forward to, you know, big Beethoven symphony or something, you're like, yeah, you know, I'm really, you know, good orchestra or something, you're like, wow, I'm really looking forward to them playing it. And then you get some other piece that you have never heard the name of the composer about or so. Or I think something like Prokofiev 7, these kind of pieces are really passion of mine, and I'm adding more and more of these pieces to my repertoire, you know, kind of like, you know, learning Stanhammer second at the moment, and there are some, you know, I like Shostakovich 12, for example. These pieces that are neglected for a reason that I don't quite understand. I mean, I personally just love Prokofiev 7 Symphony. It's one of, I just, when I heard it the first time, I was completely mesmerized, absolutely mesmerized. And I was like, I need to do the piece. I love it. And then I realized, as it happens, it doesn't get played that often. And so I got it more and more on the schedules because, you know, when I suggested it to orchestra administrators, they were like, oh yeah, Prokofiev 7, you can definitely do. Nobody else does it, right? So it's great to have these kind of pieces as a guest conductor to offer. Because, you know, then you get a piece that you really want to do. And I think for an orchestra, it's also nice now and then to play a piece that is beautiful, but that you haven't played like in the last 10 years, right? Now and then, I guess this curiosity is interesting. You get to learn a new piece and you get to enjoy it. It's fresh, keeps things fresh,
yeah.
I think.
Well, and in terms of programming, does it differ when, like, whether you're programming for one of your orchestras where you're the music director versus guest conducting elsewhere? Like, how much back and forth is there generally with like the other orchestras or their managements or their music director in terms of determining what's going to be a good program, or do you basically have free reign in both places?
No. I've, as a music director, I in both ways, I don't have really free reign. As a music director, I have more free reign, of course, but then you have to, you know, I always try to take into consideration, what do I think does the orchestra need to develop? You know, what kind of sound do I want to establish? In certain seasons, you have certain themes or certain ideas. You know, you can say like, you know, in that season, I want to highlight, you know, female composers, or in that season, I want to highlight composer performers who kind of like are both soloists and composers. You know, there are different things to do. As a guest conductor, you're of course much more limited because you have to work together with the organization. I mean, you know, normally, otherwise I would always say like, you know, Mahler Symphony, you know, that's my totally core repertoire, but obviously that's music director repertoire. So I normally don't get to do it. Although I did a Mahler 5 with Indianapolis as a guest conductor. So now and then you know, music directors don't want that, but yeah, you have to be really prepared to make suggestions, get counter suggestions, figure it out. I will say I'm quite stubborn, you know, so but I'm always open to talk. So I think with me and artistic administrators is often that we get on the phone and we just like talk for an hour, have different ideas, talk it through, and then we come up with an idea that both sides, you know, often like. Yeah. It would be very strange if you can't come to a kind of like compromise that both sides really like, right? There are so many pieces out there.
Well, and when you bring a piece that's less familiar to the musicians, like the Prokofiev, do you find, like, do you approach the rehearsals and differently than if it were a piece that's really familiar? Like if they're not just learning your interpretation of a piece, but really learning the piece for the first time?
Maybe in North America less so, because for two reasons. First of all, musicians are very prepared, I think, generally. You know, when you think about our first rehearsal with Prokofiev 7, I mean, yeah, there were a couple of, you know, wrong notes here and there maybe or so, but I mean, the orchestra could play the piece, right? It wasn't like we really started from scratch. I really had the feeling everybody knew their part, and then you can just put it together. I think with pieces that are less known, the advantage is that you're not, that you don't ever have to fight against preconceptions, right, of how the piece is supposed to be done. But of course, you know, you need to give the musicians, I think, a little bit more time to just play and get to know the piece. I'm sure I think you will agree most probably that when you play a piece that you don't know so much, you wanna go through it a couple of times so that you kind of like have a chance to hear what are your colleagues playing, where do I sit in this chord, what are the strings actually doing while I have this solo. So I think in that way it helps if the piece is less familiar to just like, you know, to play sometimes a little bit broader strokes, really kind of like zone in on the difficult passages, but then kind of like, you know, go back maybe to the beginning and give it another go so that people have time to familiarize themselves with it.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned like a few pieces that you think deserve to be played more, like Shostakovich 12, various others. I'm curious, are there any other, like either lesser known pieces by well-known composers or just lesser known composers in general that you wish would be performed more often?
Yeah, I think, like, you know, like I mentioned, I think Stenhammer's Second Symphony is amazing. I mean, now that Berlin Philharmonic has just performed it, I think a year ago, I hope it gets a little bit more spread, but that's an unbelievable piece. I do Schubert's 10th Symphony, the reconstruction by Brian Newbold, that I think is absolutely gorgeous. But also, I mean, like, I do, for example, all the Schubert symphonies. So earlier Schubert's, you know, 1, 2, 3, I do a lot, and so that don't get performed so often. Even, yeah, like, my principal cellist always goes on about Haydn, you know, like how Haydn has a lot of symphonies that nobody knows and that are great pieces. Then, you know, like we spoke, Prokofiev 7. I'm sure I forget a lot of pieces, but I try to dig and explore now and then. I actually do it like really as an explorer. Like Johann Svensson has written a beautiful Second Symphony, you know, that basically nobody knows that I've, you know, conducted one time. I think there are great pieces out there. And then, of course, like in the contemporary music, you know, that there's, you know, fantastic composers like, you know, Golyov, Gabriela Smith or so, that write fantastic pieces, and that I'd wish that also in contemporary music, there would be more of a focus on discovering people that you like. Like I have a couple of composers that I know, I generally like their style. And so I try to feature them like in my programs, particularly as a music director when I can. And often I think like with contemporary music, it's often such a broad stroke, you know, like, let's just play this and this and this and this. And then you have like a lot of different composers in a season. Whereas I like also in that case more, okay, I try to identify a couple of contemporary composers that I really stand behind and then try to feature them, you know, more often.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. So, you know, obviously in this particular time, it's very hard to make plans for the near future. I'm curious though, like, do you have any projects you're excited about on the horizon, whether, you know, during COVID time or after?
Yeah, I mean, we found a venue with my chamber orchestra where it seems we can perform. It's not a regular concert venue. It's actually a, you know, officially I think it's a catering venue, but it's an incredible, beautiful space that sounds actually pretty nice as well, where we can have like, you know, audience in a socially distant way in there, and we can play with the musicians also spread out. As a chamber orchestra, of course, you have the advantage that you can put, you know, smaller pieces also together and less musicians on stage. So we're trying to craft something there. And then, you know, I have a couple of weeks still on my calendar in Europe that seem to hold, you know, let's hope they will hold, you know, you never know. With like for me, I see my schedule this season. I said to my manager, I see it like that. For me, my schedule is empty and everything I'm doing is a huge bonus. You know, that's for me a kind of like more positive, you know, way to think about it. It's hard. I think it's lesser hard in some ways as a music director because I always have a task, right? As a music director, even, you know, in the summer when we didn't play and when we had to cancel everything in March, April, May, there was a lot of activities for me to do, lots of Zoom calls, lots of board meetings, lots of kind of like helping the executive director with the calculations, talking with musicians and so. So in some ways, I think as a music director, in comparison to other musicians, I have the advantage that I still, a part of my job is anyway there as a task. You know, the orchestra needs to survive. We need to go through this crisis and get through it, you know, with as little harm as possible. Connecting to donors, connecting to audience members, connecting to board members, you know, it's very important to keep that going. But in musical terms, like I have decided that I will learn scores ahead, you know, as much as I can, as much as I know about the future seasons, and finally mark all the Beethoven and Schubert symphonies, the parts, because they are half marked, like in my chamber orchestra, you know, partly marked. And so I go through, I put all the sets together in my workroom and I go through all the parts and just like, you know, finish marking them in the next months, which will be a big project. It takes a lot of time. So whatever we can do, right? It's
yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much for, you know, taking the time to do yet another Zoom call. I'm
no,
sure you
thank
do
you for having
many.
me. No. It's I love it. Like, are you kidding me? Speaking to people is great.
Well, like I said, every time you've come to work with Pacific Symphony, everybody's just so happy and excited. And, you know, when I got to work with you up in LA, again, it's like, you know, it's just such a joy. And, you know,
me
I
too,
hope once
for me
everything
as well.
gets back.
For me as well. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I hope that when things get back to normal, that, you know, you will definitely come back many times.
I'm all for it. It's something, you know, that's the things to look forward to, right? You know, these things become so special when you look at a video like the Prokofiev 7 and you're like, you know, but eventually as brutal as the situation is for many musicians, and there is no sugarcoating it, but you know, eventually we will get together on stage again and have unbelievable concerts, and you know, maybe feel it even more as a special occasion, because we know like it can be taken away. So yeah, I very much hope that we see each other on stage in the future and do something together again. Yeah.
Yes, me too. We'll put that in the universe, out into the universe.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you to everybody
so much, Ben. Great talking to you. Thank you very much. Have a
great to
have a
talk
good day,
to you
good
too.
evening. Bye.
Bye. Thanks to everybody for coming, and I'll see you next week.